So today I want to talk a little bit about the concept of embracing the human. We often use this phrase, human-computer interaction. We saw a lovely set of papers and award-winning papers at that had the concept of the user embedded in them. And yet what I find really interesting when I'm working with people, particularly across a variety of different disciplines, is that sometimes the human is actually a little bit lost in the shuffle, or sometimes more in the background than we might anticipate. So this is what I want to talk through today, and there's definitely going to be some time for conversation at the end. I'd like to start certainly by acknowledging the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands RMIT conducts its business, and I respectfully acknowledge our ancestors, their ancestors and elders, past, present, and emerging. So if you're not familiar with where I'm coming from, if you're not familiar with my work, one of the overarching features throughout my career has really been working across a variety of disciplines. From even when I did my own schooling, as I said, I have a background in English, Lang, and Lit. I have a degree in education. I've kind of played in a lot of different spaces, and that's something that I've continued to use as a defining feature to really delve into why we do the research we do, how our different paradigms and perspectives shape how we think. And I've been very drawn always from, again, early days in my career around human-based methodologies and different ways that we can engage people. Generally, that means I do a lot of qualitative research, but I also do a ton of mixed methods, or what I like to call mixed paradigm work, because all of these reflect different ways that we tap into kind of human experience and what we understand of the way that people engage. So today I want to talk through a few examples to kind of highlight some of the points that I want to make and to get you thinking. To me, a good keynote should maybe be a little bit provocative. It should start to kind of jazz you up, get you excited, even if it's 2 in the morning where you happen to be at this present time. Another piece of my work, and this is again global context that many of us are embedded in at the moment, and there's my word cloud, got to have 1 or 2 of those in every presentation, is always around this idea of impact. We keep hearing the word impact. Many of our governments and our universities are embracing it. And I like to use the phrase societal impact. It's a big shift that's happening now, moving us not fully away from measures of academic impact. All the bibliometrics studies are absolutely still on point, but it's starting to now layer additional expectations on our researchers around showing what the value of our work is to broader society. So we're under this kind of additional gaze and additional levels of accountability and pressures. And that's really reshaping everything from the way that our workload is managed in universities, especially in places like Australia and the UK, as well as just how do we get tax dollars to fund the research that we want to do. With the rise of sustainable development goals, we're starting to see that fully embraced again by universities, which is fantastic. But embedded in those is this underlying imperative around social and societal impact. One of the things that we're talking about here in Australia is really what that ethos is starting to look like, and really embracing impact as part of the entire end-to-end process of thinking about the value of research. This report came out a couple of years ago by colleagues of mine here at RMIT, really thinking about this move. For many of us, many universities, many research teams may still be sitting in that first generation space of starting to understand how can we make our research more publicly accessible, how can we get people using the innovations or applying the innovations that we've developed. But we're trying to kind of move everybody now towards what we're thinking of as a 3rd generation, where effectively the societal impact piece is not something that's an add-on at the end of a traditional project, but that it's something that's part of the ecosystem. It's part of how we see what the point of research is, what the role of the university is. And obviously this is a work in progress. This is not something that is done or fully implemented, although the rhetoric is starting to move in this direction. It's sometimes the case that our research teams may not even be at 1st generation stage. So we have to start thinking differently about the way that we put teams together, the way that we think about our work. And some of the examples I want to talk about today are very much coming out of more of a systems and user experience perspective, just by way of example. I often define myself as an information behavior scholar, even though that's its own bit of a black box for those of you who know the literature and the way we love to play with definitions of ourselves. But this idea that we're seeing the person in context. We're understanding how they're going to use and apply information. And I've often looked at the role of technology in this space. And yet so much of the way we work continues to put ourselves into little tiny boxes, little silos that sometimes don't connect. And that's particularly the case when we're dealing with across a number of cognate disciplines. So there will still be computer scientists, for example, who kind of know off the edges that there's this person out there that will use the technology they're creating, but really deeply understanding what that looks like sometimes remains a bit elusive. And those folks can continue to do their work. They can publish papers, they can get workload points in their universities. And as a colleague said to me recently, the reason they do that is because they don't necessarily want to work with people. And I say, well, that's absolutely fine. That's not a negative. It's actually putting boundaries around what's my area of expertise, what's my strength. But the key thing is to not stop there, to then find people who love to work with people and to build partnerships and start to actually extend our thinking is where I come from. For me, I love working with people. I like that human component that other people maybe don't like. And that I'd rather do that than code all day. Yes, I could code if I wanted to. It's not how I choose to spend my time. So thinking from that perspective then, it's really, for me, about really understanding what do we mean by context? What do we mean by understanding the people within it? I was writing a paper with a colleague, which I'll come back to in a minute, about memorialization and the product designs that go around memorializing. And this paper came across my desk, Stein-Gottved. I don't know that any of you have looked at this paper, but it was talking about the use of QR codes on gravestones. Fascinating topic, certainly one that's completely understudied. But what was interesting about it was talking about things like the actual physical placement of the QR code, the way that someone then at the gravesite would interact with that QR code. And you start to think about something that's meant to be, in a way, a simple information delivery system with complex computing behind it, being this very embodied experience for the person who's visiting that relative's gravestone and trying to connect in some way or to learn more about people and the history of their lives. So it's really then about consciously trying to think about how will this get used? What will be the broad context in which it's used? And even within information behavior, we're just starting to really embrace the concept of embodiment. So this is something that's actually quite new to many of our disciplines, to really embed the tech in a way that positions the person in real time in the space in which they're going to engage. Of course, I mentioned a minute ago, I've changed universities. So this is also very front of mind as I started to wander around and find my new office space. So these photos are actually hot off the press from the new space that I've moved into. And as I walked around the space, now part of this is obviously post-COVID. People are only just starting to go back in the office here in Australia. I've been working at home for 2 years. It's a bizarre concept to think that, there's this office that sits somewhere and I'll now be embedded in it. But from a design standpoint, these are some of the aspects, and you'll recognize these from your institution. The first one is the concept of the sit and stand desk. And what does that mean? We have to be really mindful that the monitor doesn't go flying when I push the button on that desk because of all the wires in behind. In the second image, it's this idea that, yes, we can map out laptop spaces and where will people be able to hot desk, but when the sun's streaming in and there are no curtains to break the heat, especially here in Oz, that's not a comfortable space. No one's going to want to work in that type of space. And so much of our space design now is moving towards open plan, right? It's cheap, it's easy, people can hot desk. We don't need offices, right? Unless you're my colleague in the health sciences who said to me recently, I can't be in one of these spaces because the material I'm dealing with is so sensitive, and my ethics requires me to have a private space where I alone am the witness to these documents. We can't accommodate her in these kinds of spaces. So as we're thinking about systems design, as we're thinking about tools and technologies, mobile or otherwise, we've got to also be thinking about physical space, the location of the space, and how people are going to move in it. This takes me to one of my recent projects where I partnered with wine scientists, a number of people that work in the field of wine science. This is not an area that I knew anything about, aside from perhaps enjoying a glass of red wine. And yet these folks really had created a number of innovations in the space they were working in, and they were really struggling to bring those innovations into industry, into the space in which change can actually happen. So we designed this project that involved a number of industry partners, everything from small kind of mom and pop wineries up to very large companies, to understand how we could actually bring some of these research innovations through to the design and implementation phase. One of the things that we did in this project, there were a number of kind of small side projects within it, but one of them was to look at the Horticulture Industry Network website, which is run by a government organization. And to me, it kind of typified what we still see in web design. A team somewhere created a site. People thought, yep, this looks good. We want to bring all this reams of information to the people. It's managed by experts in the content area, not by people who understand information architecture. You've probably heard these kinds of stories before, again and again. They did no user assessment up the front. They've done no post-design testing. It was absolutely someone's product that was put up onto the site, and they wanted to see whether or not it was actually meeting the brief. Was it actually helping? So we came in and we designed a number of qualitative approaches. We interviewed the users. We tried to kind of look at it from their perspective. We also did a deep heuristic assessment just to understand if it even met the baseline of what we would expect of good architectural design. In short, not surprisingly, users hated it. They really, really disliked this site. It was confusing. It was busy. They couldn't understand the point. The written brief of what the site was intended to do was not reflected in either the content, the navigation, need I go on? Not to mention the fact that it didn't meet many of the base heuristics. So not surprising to any of us, this site was really failing its user group, and they were spending a lot of time, a lot of money, dedicated teams of staff feeding into the machine. So through this work, we were really able to kind of illuminate these problems, bring absolutely new information to the team in a very carefully managed way, as you can appreciate. I'm being very open with you today, but we were very careful and very respectful of the time and energy that was put in. And our entire end goal was really to help them get to a better design and a better product. And through this process, that team suddenly understood what was missing. We had a framework to go forward. We had a way that we could approach redesign. So a success story in the end, there's tons of research that can still be done in this area. But I used to say to people, how can I possibly go one website at a time through the rest of my life? I feel like I could do that if I wanted to, but we've got to start looking at broader wholesale change. Another example coming out of that project relates to app design. Certainly, if you pay attention to what happens in granting councils these last few years, you may know that a lot of money is going into app design. Lots of people seeing having a web app as a way to have impact. We'll do our research, then we'll create an app and we'll share everything with the people. Very, very common process. But again, unless you're coming at this from a user perspective and really understanding what's needed, you could end up spending a lot of time and money on products that actually don't meet anyone's needs. Playing with wine industry is really fascinating because a lot of the practices in the industry really come down to people's own senses. You know, how does a grape feel? What does the weather literally look like? How does the weather pattern change from day to day? And decades of that kind of embodied knowledge and deep practices that are not easily, very tacit, not easily documented. And yet the apps that were created are often filled with papers and studies and various bits and pieces that are quite disconnected from the person on the ground in the vineyard. So what we did with these apps is we literally went into the field, into the vineyard, walked around with some of these tools. And the folks who actually prune the vines and pick the grapes, they don't hold back. They were very, very upfront that these kinds of apps were simply immaterial to them. The one that I've always loved, highlighted there in red, is this quote: "It's very hard to see when you're out here in the sun." The entire point of these apps is to use them in the vineyard, but the glare on the screen made it absolutely impossible to do that. So even that basic level, that if someone had walked out in the vineyard, they would have known that this wasn't going to work, let alone some of the deeper information that's embedded in the app. Again, a failure in terms of what the product is meant to do. And in these cases, we're seeing, one of these apps receive funding in the neighborhood of $150,000 to create. How could we have spent that money? Where could we have spent that money to actually get to a better end product? So I want to turn now to kind of thinking then about this end-to-end design concept and give you an example of a project where they actually turned the tables on how to approach something. So this brings me back to the concept of memorialization. I worked with a team, very interdisciplinary team here in Melbourne, again, comprising designers, architects, engineers, and historians who were commissioned to create Melbourne's Korean War Memorial. A lot of layers to this in terms of the community partners, both here in Australia and also in South Korea, and a team that is coming at the problem from very, very different ways. This process started out with deep on-site reviews. What's interesting about it, many people, myself included, I'm not an architect. I don't know how that work is done, but we had long discussions about the fact that the team needed to be physically on site, looking at materials, understanding, the pitch of the roof, understanding the lay of the land, literally, in the spaces that they were going to be using. Particularly here in Oz, where they effectively had a field that they were working at where this memorial was going to be built, but they first needed to understand some other locations in order to position the design that they were hoping for. They also then did a number of scoping workshops because the goal was a real co-design process from initial idea of what this was going to look like right through to the final design, to ensure that they were reflecting cultural imperatives, that they were really being respectful of the families and of the veterans who were engaged in the war. This meant a number of community town halls. So for example, 300 plus attendees coming to some of these events where they were showing initial sketches, drafts, photographs of site, different types of materials to really get that feedback in this constant kind of an iterative process. That was combined with a number of small group design workshops where they had key stakeholders looking at all aspects of the design. As you can imagine, this process was time consuming. We're talking end to end, probably a 2-year process all up. But throughout each stage of this work, it was about building relationship with community. It was about teaching their own university partners around some of the innovations in design that they could play with, and ultimately very much about a user-centered perspective. Prototype development was done at scale. So even taking these images, paper mock-ups of what the final design was going to be and working it through until it was literally embedded in the concrete. The second image is a really interesting one because part of the design, they use these punches. So all of the images that you see are made of tiny little holes that are punched into the material, but then they would be able to kind of have people placing poppies on Memorial Day so that they could actually involve people in a more interactive way was the goal. But again, every single step of the process had various members of the community involved, right down to what wording was going to appear, what images were going to appear on the memorial. All of this to say that we have to start thinking then about a completely mixed paradigm approach to doing research design. One of my challenges with the phrase mixed methods is that it implies that everything is just kind of plug and play. I'll insert qualitative interview method here and we're good. Rather than actually seeing this as each of us embedded and trained within a paradigm, within a way of seeing the world, within a way of thinking about research, and how do we actually shift our paradigm, shift our thinking so that it embraces everyone else. I think the key piece for me is understanding that we don't all have to be experts in another paradigm. We don't have to become expert in qual when we're into structural equation modeling, but we do need to be open to working with other people, understanding the value that they bring. And then we have to teach them about the quant approach or the experimental approach as well. So it really is a mind shift in how we want to think about what we do. For me, in the computing spaces in particular, as well as some of the other STEM disciplines, it's really about partnering with qualitative researchers. It's about bringing in the sociologists, the anthropologists, the people who are not just familiar with the method, but familiar with the theory, the paradigm, the epistemology that underlies that method, so that that person can actually start to help to shape what the project will become. And this means bringing those people in at part of the project planning phase. By the time you've gotten to implementation and you think, oh, we should do some interviews or we should test out the app after it's designed, it's too late. We've got to have that done at the beginning if we want to be really smart and be using money effectively and be thinking about design in a new way. For me, then, a few kind of key lessons or takeaways to lead into our discussion today. I really believe we've got to widen our worldviews across paradigms and really kind of position that as being central to our design practice. We've got to recognize that quantitative and experimental practice only gets us so far. If we want human-focused design, we actually need to embed human-focused practices. To do that, we've got to broaden our networks. We've got to break down the discipline silos that our institutions keep popping up for us, and find different ways that we can engage across methodological and epistemological approaches. And ultimately, it's about strong ongoing partnerships, investing that time, building strong teams. Yes, this is an investment of time. It's not a quick solution, but once you've got teams of researchers that you can build as a collaborative, you can be going back and working with those folks again and again, drawing in new areas, new disciplines as opportunities emerge. On that note, very happy to open the floor and chat more about these ideas.
Oh, yeah, I see a raised hand. Dana. And Lorianne. So Dana, if you want to go first, and then Lorianne.
So you were talking about people playing to their own strengths in terms of their preferred research methods. And you also spoke about a number of projects where you were working with people with different research strengths to you. What are your top tips for bridging that gap to get the best outcome for the ultimate people who use the products that we're developing?
Great question. I think the first one is I'm a really strong believer in building collaborations over coffee or a glass of wine or whatever context. I think we have to start by partnering with people that we enjoy talking with, that we're happy to throw ideas around. One of the challenges I find is universities are often trying to do speed dating CV matching, where they'll say, oh, you know about apps, you should work with this person in health who's wanting to create an app. But if that person's not open to my perspective, is not willing and able to kind of embrace this as a concept, it's going to be tough, and we're going to take a lot longer to convince that person. So I have found that many of my collaborations have come out of incidental meetings with people, meeting of the minds, chats at talks, and sometimes that's the best starting place, because when you meet cool and interesting people and you find you've got some shared interests, that's where the magic happens. So that would be one of my first tips. The second one, I think, is to be, because, that in a way, that relationship investment is critical for the next tip, which is to be really open with people about your own areas where you lack understanding or you don't know how something works. We're not expert in everything, and we don't need to be. But when you're able to work with a team where each person, can take the lead on different elements, and we know who's the person with expertise on this versus that, and it's a respectful partnership, then again, the magic can happen in those spaces. It's often about finding people where it's not ego that's driving the thing, it's curiosity. And you first have to have people who are going to get that they don't know everything, that they want to learn. So I've been very lucky to work with people who really just deeply want to understand, what is this thing about qual? How do sociologists think? How do information scientists think? And then we put projects together. Thanks,
Great.
Dana.
Lorianne, I believe you're next, and then Rob.
Hello, thanks for this fantastic talk, really inspiring. I wanted to know if you could just elaborate a little bit on how you would draw research questions that would be relevant, particularly to the cheer community, from, for example, looking at a website design or creating an app.
Yep. So I think for me, the first step is really thinking about questions like, is this app necessary? Is almost the very first precursor. And that sounds really simple, but that's usually not where projects begin. So one of the wine apps that I was mentioning really started out of wine agriculturalists and wine scientists going, oh, we should create an app, literally because apps are cool. Everybody has one, and we don't have one in our discipline, right? We need one that will, and then they start imagining, what would an app do, right? And they start thinking about some of the unique tools or techniques or things that they themselves as researchers want to see. So for me, the research problem and the research questions start with the people. So it's flipping everything on its head to start with, who will use this app? Why would they want to use it? What use would they make of an app? Is an app even necessary? So when I spoke to people in the Vineyard, for example, they did not understand the value add that an app was bringing to their lives. They said to me, I already know this stuff. Myself and my dad and my granddad have been making wine for 100 years, right? We know when it's time to pick the grapes. We know when it's time, to do different pruning techniques, all of that. Why is this app going to help me? And the short answer was, it wasn't going to. They could certainly identify areas where an app could help, right? And so it was getting to that point. And if that had been the starting conversation, rather than the build being the starting conversation, there would be an app potentially, but it would look very, very different. So for example, a lot of people in the wine industry, they were really needing help on business and finance, human resource supports, how to manage the economics of running a vineyard. They did not need help with pruning. And that was a big, big shift for the wine science team to understand that they got the question wrong. I hope that helps to answer your question. It's about positioning the person first and projecting into their heads through evidence base. So we start with user needs assessment.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. Rob, I think you're next.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you. Really interesting and thought-provoking talk. So I teach classes on UX design and you know, contextual design and things like this. So really resonated what you're, you know, sort of saying here. One of the things that I've been thinking as you were talking, that I have a lot of students that are interested in doing things that are related to sort of these situated interactions like you described, right? And some of them are with apps, some of them are with virtual reality or augmented reality and things like this. And I just find that that's one of the harder things to sort of grapple with, right? Because we don't know what some of those interactions need to be like or could even be like. And I wondered if maybe you had some thoughts or guidance about, like, especially with the design of the Korean War Memorial, you know, how, it occurred to me that people that design those kinds of memorials think about that sort of thing in ways that we probably don't.
Yeah, completely. It's a really great question. And I think that's really an area that, you know, we often don't think about. We're often thinking about research. I think from a teaching practice, that's really the front line on where can we actually start to play with some of these ideas, and maybe putting together mixed interdisciplinary student teams to investigate some design problems would be one way to tap into some of that thinking. You know, I was amazed when I started working with the industrial designers, because we often think, we outside of those disciplines, that they're really sitting down, you know, with the computer renderings, and they're doing all of this work by machine, and that it's a very literally industrial process, which it is. But the fact that they were thinking about the average height of people, and where would the eye sit, you know, as you were walking through the memorial, what would the pitch of the ramp be that goes through the memorial? And then being across things like they didn't make the pitch on the ramp as high as they wanted to do it, because there were then rules and regs that kick in about needing handrails. And then the handrails were going to be affecting the visible design, and they wanted a better aesthetic than that. So they changed the entire pitch on the ramp to protect the artistic aesthetic of what the design looked like. So at any one time, they were thinking across 6 or 8 different issues that affected history, architecture, engineering, but they were doing it seamlessly because they could, everyone that needed to be there was at the table. So it's about having that perspective, I think, represented. How do we, so, you know, a good example in the VR space is the way that, like, some people get visibly, physically ill from virtual reality, right? And when I've gone to VR things in galleries and museums, you know, they've got all these disclaimers up on the wall, and what's it going to do to the body? You know, that's an entirely amazing area that could potentially intersect with people who are working in health, psychology, as well as just the visible design. We've got people who would be working in dance and movement, for example. But our challenge is that, you know, we're still linear in the way that we train up PhD students. We're still embedding them only in singular disciplines. So I think it needs to start in the education space, and trying to put those teams together early.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rob.
Peter, and then George.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, great talk. Love the focus on users as always. It's so important and refreshing. I guess I'm coming at it from an applied scientist perspective within kind of an industrial company setting over the last few experiences for me. And one of the challenges that I've seen is this, we still design, even when we are trying to design for users, but it's designed for everyone with a single user experience. And we don't do a great job of really thinking deeply about how to adapt or adjust product design to say, you know, actually we have maybe 20 different types of users, all of whom might be using the product in different ways. So I'm just curious to hear what you're thinking in that space of, like, how do you inform product design in ways that allow that experience to either adapt or be selected by individuals to meet their own interaction needs?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And, you know, we already know often that a lot of our designs are only reflecting, you know, one type of person, often male of a certain age, etc. Half the battle is actually making sure that we've got that representation at the table. So I tend to use a lot of very purposeful maximum variation sampling in the approaches that I use. So for example, going back to the Vineyard, if I had not included both managers of vineyards and the individuals that literally clip the vines in the field, I would have very, very different perspectives, because the manager of the vineyard might see benefit in certain design practices or may not think about things like the glare of the sun. But the person who's literally on the ground in that vineyard, they may not be thinking about the business aspect and the economics of it, but they're definitely worried about how will I make this item function in the field. So I think a lot of design goes awry because people will try to do things quickly on a shoestring. They think of the user as an afterthought, right? Oh, we should test this with a few people. And they tend to then go very much, who's here on the hallway? We see that kind of design. And that's where you get the same, you know, wine science, again, very good example, because it's about 80–90% male. You don't get a lot of female perspectives. And that will change everything from how something works on a device. The size of people's fingers, right, will affect the product design. And yet we know this at one level, but we then don't plan for that. And I think it's about purposeful, you know, very intentional inclusion of the range of users and trying to interrogate, who will this not work for? So we often are thinking always positive forward. And once it resonates with a small group of people, we might go, oh, that'll work. You know, if you go back to things like Nielsen's 5 user principles, it wasn't meant to be 5 users of the same type and then another five people of the same type and another 5. It was actually meant to be a very iterative and constantly interrogative process of design.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really great thing. I'll have to look up maximal variation sampling. That sounds like super helpful as well. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Great, thank you for your question, Peter. George?
So it's nice to have someone say mobile apps aren't the answer to everything, because being a developer of mobile apps for a long time, I've had, oh, we'll do a mobile app and that'll solve everything. And it's like, yeah.
I wish.
I wish. But actually, you mentioned the field of medicine, which is one I've done a fair amount of work in. And I think it's one example of a different problem with perspectives, which is that often they're coming with the view of, well, developers will just, never mind the users, developers are just there to implement what they already know. You know, that they essentially know much more, and they just need what a Northern would call a spanner man, gendered term, but, you know, someone just, you know, tighten something up and do something fairly simple and mundane to finish their work of genius. But I think actually medicine is a second level, and Dana, who's in the same room as me over there, has had this experience recently where medical people essentially view everything through an idea of compliance. That, you know, there is the ideal clinical way in which, yeah, the users should do what's right for them within a narrow definition of what's right. And that's an even deeper issue of not just how we collaborate internally, but actually how the collaborative unit works with the outside world, if you will. Give some thoughts about those sorts of challenges where there's a deeper thing even for the collaboration stage.
Yes, most definitely, George. And, you know, I would also start with, sadly, the health area doesn't always actually have the patient's perspective at the heart of what they're doing either. That's maybe not groundbreaking idea for those of you who work with health, but a lot of us think instinctively that they do, that a patient's always, doctor's always looking out for the patient. And that gets fed into design practice as well. So I've done a lot of work, particularly around research ethics and the ethic of qualitative practice in health, for example. And there, for example, the default idea that things should be anonymous is actually not what patients want. Many patients want to be identified. They want to be able to share their knowledge. You know, one might argue that's why things like discussion boards online became so big around different health diagnoses. And yet still the default in many medical communities is that we need to anonymize everything. So part of this is actually taking that user-centered perspective into the patient area as well, really seeing patients as having expertise in their own right that should feed into design. And there will be places where the patient imperative is completely at odds with the medical community and the medical system. So there are a lot of there's a lot of IT development happening in health. And what I find is they don't have anyone that does the user experience, info behavior piece. I think it's a huge area for folks around the chair traps because they will bring in the health expert, a computing scientist, and neither of those groups actually understands the user experience. So they'll hire out someone to build the thing that they have conceived of from a health systems lens. And that's the kiss of death. You know, that's the problem. And yet it gets replicated and millions of dollars are being spent in designing these systems.
And what you were saying there reminds me of another problem. Also, there's a stratification within health.
Yes.
A colleague of mine witnessed quite literally a consultant take a fire axe to a door because they were being obstructed, they felt. And similarly, the consultants hiding ward-based access to PubMed to make sure nurses and other professions allied to medicine couldn't access the information, because that shouldn't happen either. So sometimes the problem isn't the patient even, but thanks very much.
But the layers of hierarchy and you know, that's one of the challenges. I mean, even the concept of interdisciplinarity in health is fractured. There are a lot of issues. I've worked with a lot of people in nursing and speech pathology and some of those other areas, and the notion of the physician as the overriding decision maker is absolutely embedded in the practice. So that health to me is a fascinating area to work in, which is why I've worked with a lot of people, because they so need us, right? They need us to be coming in and questioning some of their base assumptions. And the more that they embrace technology, the deeper those can become entrenched if we're not there to query the decisions.
Great. Tina.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa, for the great talk. I wonder, you know, as an information behavior researcher, you know, how, did you teach, or how do you teach or communicate with people who are not familiar with the area or have seen the area as a black box?
Oh, that's a really great question. I spend a lot of my time doing what I call translation work. I really try to very consciously spend time articulating how I've come to think about the world. So sometimes it can be as simple as passing along a really great reference. One of my favorite books is by Vivian Burr called Introduction to Social Constructionism, because it's an extremely accessible window into kind of relative ways of knowing. And I always say to people, beware if you've never read it, because it's one of those books that will change the way you think. But the way she writes is so clear, so accessible, that people who've come up in other paradigms, like some of the STEM sciences, can read it and make sense of it. It's meant to kind of speak to those audiences. So I do a lot of that work. One of the graphic I showed near the end of my talk that's about collaborating across the paradigms, and it's got that figure, is actually the result of a paper that's just coming out. It's just currently in press with colleagues in ecology. And we actually co-designed that graphic as a way to understand our own practices and where a qualitative, sociological perspective had to come in to inform their practice. So using those opportunities to talk to the teams, not just about content, but about collaborative practice, interdisciplinarity, epistemology, is half the battle. Almost everyone I've met and worked with in STEM has sadly never really been aware of a lot of different pieces of writing and ways of thinking that we in more of the HAS disciplines would be very, would come to mind very commonly. Even just ideas of postmodernism, relativism, the differences between subjectivity, objectivity, they're not open to those ideas because they've never been exploring them in their schooling.
Great, thanks.
All right, we still have 10 minutes, so if anybody has a question.
I don't know if there's anything in the chat either, Jaime, because I've not had time to kind of take a. You've been scanning.
There is a lot in the chat. If anybody has asked a question in the chat, you should just ask it live because
we got time.
Yeah, we've got time. There's a lot of there's a lot of side conversation in the chat too.
No,
I'll tell you what, I don't have a new question, but Lisa, you've mentioned a bunch of different resources here. I wonder if you would be kind enough to forward those on to somebody that can distribute them out to us, because I didn't get a chance to take note about all of them, especially that last one.
Sure, yes, we'll do, no worries. I can put that in the chat as well.
I guess I'll ask a question if nobody has a question, since I am the moderator. I guess in your experience, can you comment a little bit on, I mean, there's an underlying theme of involving humans and users and a variety of users earlier on in the design process, and how that results in just better products, a better end result. In your experience, are there specific or certain types of insights or research questions that are very difficult to address without having a finished product that has been designed using, just having a complete finished product?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, most of the design work I do is without a finished product. So the idea is actually to, we tend to identify early stage areas what we think might be pain points in the process. So for example, terminology is always a big one. What are you going to label things? Are they going to make sense to people? How does it function? Aspects of navigation, for example. But also just generally trying to tap into if people could design an ideal tool, what would it look like? So sometimes it's starting with some very unstructured open questions and a very deep facilitated conversation around a design. And what will happen is many people will default to kind of talking about things they've seen before, the way an iPhone works or the way some other system works. And so that's where you've got to have a really skilled facilitator who kind of won't let them stop there, but kind of say, yeah, but do you like that feature? Does it work for you? What do you not like about that feature? And then you start to really tap into people's way of really thinking. I've been doing some work lately with, MS Teams, for example, because most people around the world seem to really dislike this platform, even though we're sometimes stuck using it. And when you start to ask people, well, what, put all these systems aside, what would your ideal system look like? What features would it have? What functionality would it have? And even getting them to talk about existing features that don't work gives you a window into what might work. And then being able to do mock-ups and bring people examples. It doesn't even have to be live. Often we might use, I've used print pieces of paper. I've used Post-it notes and recipe cards, and we do a lot of whiteboarding exercises. Then come back with something that might look a little stylized. It might just be a set of PowerPoint slides, but it's starting to get to what a design might look like. And the key thing there is that's low stakes. You're not spending a lot of money. You're not setting up a wireframe that you're going to have to discard later. You're able to actually have, the bulk of those conversations, then create a workable prototype. And once you've got the working prototype, so one of the Vineyard apps I was talking about, not the $150,000 one, the other one, getting to that prototype stage was only about $3,000 or $4,000 of money. And then there was a workable prototype we could take out into the field. And that's where you can then start to go, okay, this doesn't work, that doesn't work. But you've not invested your entire budget in the build, and you've not promised some funder that this is what we're going to end up with. So having access to a bit of seed funding is really helpful to then be able to kind of have an evidence base to then go after bigger money. Does that help to answer?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Rob, I saw that you had your hand up for a little bit and then you took it down.
Yeah. I was about to disagree with something you said, Lisa, and then I changed my mind.
Oh, I'm sorry I put you on the
I've
spot.
convinced him. I've convinced him.
Well, no. I mean, you were talking about trying to elicit design ideas from users. And there's definitely ways of doing that with participatory design and other kinds of things. But I'm also sometimes skeptical of trying to get end users to really come up with design ideas because they're not always good at it. It's not what they think about. They can sort of dream up things that maybe they wouldn't actually use. But then you kind of filled in some of the details about how you were using it. And I was like, okay, I won't make that comment.
No. Yeah, and I totally appreciate that, because I think you're quite right. Like, we're not designers, the same as I'm not an architect, right? But I kind of know architectural designs I like and I don't like, and I know features I like and I don't like. I don't know the engineering behind it. and that's why you've got to have that mixed team, because then the architect can be there kind of going, okay, well, that'll work, that won't work. It's like that because of this reason. And then we can work around that. So it's a much more involved process. 2 thumbs up. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, and good luck for a great conference.
Thank you.